Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Matthew D. Gewirtz is the senior rabbi of Congregation B'nai Jeshurun in Short Hills, New Jersey, and serves as the president of the Coalition of Religious Leaders for the state of New Jersey. He is a fellow at the National Jewish think tank Klal, and he appears as a commentator on religion on MSNBC's Morning Joe and CNN's State of the Union. He co-anchored New Jersey's PBS program, A Matter of Faith, with an imam, bishop, and rabbi. Rabbi Gewirtz is the author of The Gift of Grief, Finding Peace, Transformation, and Renewed Life After Great Sorrow. And his most recent book, which we're going to talk about today, is called To Build a Brave Space, The Making of a Spiritual First Responder. Welcome to the broadcast.
Good to be here.
Rabbi Gewirtz. Can I call you Matt?
Of course.
Thank you. So this is, I have to point out, pre-October 7th, obviously, when you wrote this, and it's one of the rare books that kind of retraces the steps to the Bima, to your journey as a rabbi. And it was a little bit unlikely. It wasn't necessarily what you dreamed of your whole life. Can you just give a sense of kind of when the idea sparked that you wanted to be a spiritual leader?
Yeah, so I didn't dream of it, but it was in me since I was a kid. The story goes is that when I was 5 years old, I announced to my family that I'm going to be a rabbi on a motorcycle.
A rabbi on a motorcycle.
On a motorcycle.
Not sure where that image gets conjured, but...
Well, the motorcycle, I think any kid wants to ride a motorcycle.
So you're just a cool rabbi.
But the rabbi part must have come... I was living in Lynbrook, Long Island at that point, and Rabbi Harold Saperstein was really one of the giants of that generation, but stood 5'6". And I was taken by him, and I think for two specific reasons. One is 1972 Munich, where he got up, and I don't remember the words of the sermon, but he said, I'm going to fast every day, 11 days in a row for every Israeli killed. And I thought, here's someone who loves sports, who loved food, and was becoming interested in Judaism. And he gave up one for the other in the name of the third. And then a year later on Yom Kippur, I remember someone coming up, whispering into his ear, and he did something that no one would do today. He said, everyone needs to go home. War's broken out in Israel. And I remember everyone just grabbing their kids and running. And I say that because I think we probably stay in synagogue in this day and age.
But can you just go back to that moment? You describe it in the book so vividly. And it really was frightening, like terrifying. A sense, even as a kid, you knew that this was unprecedented in some way for your community or extended Jewish family.
Not only unprecedented, because remember, parents just left the TV on. They didn't, there was no helicopter and there was no hovering. They left, and then you could see the fear in their faces. And our best friends next door, their daughter had just married someone, they made Aliyah, and he was fighting in that war. So at night, I'd have dreams of Israeli tanks rolling over and of this guy Roger being killed in the Sinai. So it was really real to us. My mother was unbelievably left anti-Vietnam. And I'd walk into a room and she'd say, you will never ever fight in Vietnam, but you'll always fight for Eretz Yisrael. And I'm like, I don't want to fight anywhere. But this was ingrained as a little kid. So anyway, the point is that... But just
before you leave that contradiction which you write about, the fact that you have this pacifist mom who's like, when it comes to your people, you're going to pick up a gun. How did you reconcile that as a young person?
I mean, as a young person, I didn't reconcile it at all because it honestly scared me. And it's not something I think you want to say to your kid. But otherwise, it became a part of the fiber of my being. I just thought to myself, this will be a place that I always defend. Like I was taught to say thank you, to be polite. I was taught to be a Zionist as a kid. It's as natural as anything else was.
And your dad had relatives who perished in the Holocaust. Was that something that was also discussed as something that kind of was in your DNA?
But discussed in the way that it was in that generation. My dad was also on a minesweeper in World War II. He spent 18 months off of Japan and did not speak about it like that generation wouldn't. But slowly but surely, I would hear a story about my great-grandmother's head rolling down a Polish street and getting a letter as a kid. That's how he found out that his grandmother died. Or Uncle Chaim, who they presumed was dead because he had no one heard from him after 10 years. And one day the doorbell rang and Uncle Chaim showed up. And I said, what did Bobby do? That's what we call my grandmother. And he said, she fainted. I said, what do you mean she fainted? She literally just dropped. So he didn't sit down and say, honey, let me explain the Holocaust to you. It was just part of the stories of our being. And it wasn't seen as something magnificent or horrible, just what was for us.
You write, that's your dad, he lived with the knowledge that there would always be plenty of people who hated Jews, and therefore we should always be on guard. Growing up knowing that half of his family was murdered for no reason other than their faith legitimated that ever-present fear for him. So did you see him as a fearful person? Was there a sense that that peril was around the corner all the time?
Only when we had fights. Well, two things. First of all, never would a German product be bought in our house. No toaster, no Mercedes, no Audi, nothing like that. But I remember going to Israel with him. He was 78. He lived till he was 91 during one of the intifadas. It must have been the second one. And we were there for solidarity. And this is when buses were blowing up weekly and restaurants were blowing up. And we were doing our own trip around the country. And we had a 4-hour car ride back from a kibbutz that I lived on. And we had the worst fight we'd ever had. And he yelled, in the end, every German, every Palestinian, and every Christian wants to kill every Jew. And I said, Pop, are you insane? He was a Shakespearean. I said, you're a Renaissance man. I've seen you teach. He said, you teach for us to become different people. And he said, that's for the classroom. He said, this is what I believe inside. And it was a horrible, I thought that I could have killed him because he could have had a heart attack from how loud we were yelling at each other. We get back to the La Rome Hotel, which is now the Inbal. We had connecting rooms. He knocked on the door, he had a bottle of scotch, and he said, why don't we have a drink together? I got home and my younger sister, the youngest but the wisest, says, why would you expect anything different? His whole mentality is based on that loss. But because he did not share it with us regularly, it was shocking to me. So I knew the Holocaust, I knew about my family who died, but it was not dramatic. It just was until there was danger.
And I just want to understand, when you say that it was out of an argument that he would kind of explode in this way, was it an argument about Israel?
Yes, it was an argument that I was trying to say that there are Palestinians on the other side eventually who will want to make peace with us. And he said, you're naive and you're innocent and you don't realize what hatred really is.
Wow.
The same fight I had about Hiroshima. And I said, the use of atomic bombs. And he looked at me and he said, without that bomb, you don't exist. And then this is a liberal Democrat Shakespearean, but when it came to these issues, because of his background, this is just who he was. And thank God, I say with a sarcastic note, that he's not alive now, because this would be something he couldn't handle.
What do you mean?
I mean that he just wouldn't believe that this was possible again, even though he always warned of it. The manifestation of it would just kill him all over.
The Munich Olympics were formative for you. Can you just describe what that memory is like?
I'm a huge sports fan, still am. And I think it was Jim McKay? Mm-hmm. I feel like that's who it was. And I feel like, it was Howard Cosell announced John Lennon's killing and Jim McKay. And so I'm watching the Olympics, like any other, kid. And suddenly these announcements are made. And I don't know if you remember the story that he came from the pool and he sat in his bathing suit all day doing it because he had no time
to change.
Yeah.
Wow.
But you felt that urgency. And again, the television was on and the concerned look. Now that I just realized for the first time I saw that kind of concern on my parents' faces was 72 and 73. And maybe I've only seen it 10 times in their whole lives, but those were two of them. So it took me. And I remember by 78, 79, whenever Sadat came to Jerusalem, I was the nerdy kid with the New York Post open wide, reading every piece of it. And I realized now, because 7 years earlier, those things that were happening to Israelis were scaring the living daylights out of me.
And you go to Israel as a young person to work in a kibbutz. Was that your idea?
I was supposed to go for a week's vacation as a present from a cousin who let me down and said, for whatever reason, he wasn't going to take me. And simultaneously, I was then going to go for a year to China because my dad was a visiting professor in Shanghai, and that didn't work out. So this is my embarrassment for my kids, you should listen carefully. I rebelled once, and I said, well, I'm not going to college. I'm going off to live in Israel in a kibbutz. And to my dismay, my parents said, that's a great idea. And so I had no choice, and off I went. So it was really just an idea that came out of rebellion.
And it was hard.
I was a young, immature, prototypical American teenager who goes to a commune, a kibbutz, where day one, they hand me a hose in the kitchen. They say, you're on pots and pans. And these pots and pans were like this big. And I thought to myself, what am I doing here? You know, a phone call home was $50, so it was once a month. And my mother said to me, you have the following you have to follow. You are not allowed to come home before 6 months, and you can't stay longer than 12. And I had no idea what she meant, but what she knew was that I cried every night for the first 10 days. And then by the 10th month, I wanted to join the army and make Aliyah. And that's the only fight we had, that last phone call when I said, I'm not coming home. And she said, what do you mean? And so she went at it, and I went to my kibbutz family, and I said, could you believe my mother? Yeah, and I went on, and they said, I'll tell you something, we want you here, but you listen to your parents. And off I went.
And you came home.
Yeah.
And the first that a rabbi was kind of instrumental in your life or impactful, like when did that really happen?
It was Saperstein. I mean, we didn't know each other personally, but I looked up to him in a way that he was a magical being for me. And
because of his sermons, because of his teaching, like what do you remember?
You know, as a kid, I don't remember the words, but I do remember the energy he brought. And there was a sense, I didn't want to call it charisma because there's something that sounds slimy about that. There was, you know what it was? He believed wholeheartedly in what he preached. And again, there was the fasting. And there was something about him that was real. And he was like a hero because of it. Years later, when I went to Rodef Shalom, I was the intern and the assistant and the associate. And sure enough, who bridged the gap between Gunther Hirschberg and Robert Levine but Harold Saperstein? So, and I've always told his son, you know, David Saperstein's obviously a very prominent Jewish professional. And I said to him, you know, I just want you to know your dad is the one who pushed me here. I think I dedicated the book to Harold Saperstein.
Wow. One of the things that comes through the book is that he saw something in you, or he made you feel somehow like there was no judgment. You were in some sense your best self around him.
Not just him, you know, every rabbi once my parents got divorced, I was in every movement of Judaism. Really, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, wherever they landed and felt comfortable, they took me. So it was confusing on some levels, but every rabbi in every one of those synagogues, just lucky, were non-judgmental figures who just cared about me being who they thought I should be in life. And ultimately, isn't that what a rabbi or a priest or an imam's job is to take someone and with the understanding that God put something into us that said, that's who you're supposed to be in life, and our whole lives we're searching for it. But if you have a good rabbi, they help you remove what I call the soul brush. They take the brush out, they help you look inside, and they don't want you to do anything but be that. And great rabbis do that.
Is that something you've tried?
I try all the time. You know, I miss a lot, but that's all I try to do.
And you're very vulnerable in this book about being overweight and not necessarily so confident and not even working so hard, which is so hard because I know you, that you're one of the hardest workers. So when did that change? Like, when did you sort of feel like, okay, I'm going to put, you know, my pedal to the metal?
The working hard happened as a very young teen because my parents had no money, and I refused to walk around without $1 in my pocket. So I was already delivering meat on West End Avenue and 96th Street when I was 11 years old. And then I went on to every job you could imagine, including being a vendor at Shea Stadium for 4 years and working as a page in a library. So the hard work came because of necessity. The working hard in school, which is what I didn't do well, I was one of those people that if I had a class I loved, I got an A. If I didn't care about it, I got a C-. And it drove my parents crazy. They were educators. So it was Israel. I went there and realized kids on the program were 17 to 35 kids. I was the kid. I was 17. I was the youngest. And when I saw people who had problems that really caused them great pain, I realized it came from not taking care of oneself. So that year, I went there at 5'6" or 7", at 220 pounds. So you can imagine I was pretty big, and then I came home 5'10" and 160 pounds.
Wow.
And I've grown a little bit taller since then, I should note. So the weight changed, but so did the outlook on the world. And by the way, you meet Europeans and Israelis, And very quickly did they put Americans in their place with, why is it that you don't speak more than one language? Why don't you travel? Their whole perspective is so different. And it really taught me that I needed that foreign perspective in life.
So, Rodef, how do you land there? And that was a big place to go as early as you got there.
Yeah.
So tell us that story.
Luck. I mean, I had a very, very dear mentor that I taught with while I was still in college. And he kept on saying to me, my wife is the religious school educator at Rodef Shalom. Why don't you apply there? I had a huge amount of youth experience, so every Manhattan synagogue wanted to hire me not because they thought I was so great, but I knew kids. And so I said, I'll give Rodef a look also. And she was such a fool. She offered me $1,000 less than Stephen Wise did. And I almost went to Stephen Wise, which, fine, I'm sure Stephen Wise is wonderful. But she somehow said, I'll find you $1,000 through tutoring. And I went there. And
how old were you? Do you remember?
Yeah, I was 26. I was just coming back from rabbinic school first year, maybe 27. And Robert Levine was the senior rabbi. Aaron Pankin, Olive Shalom, was the associate rabbi. And Joe Kay was the educator. And the three of them raised me and made me into the rabbi I am today. To this day, I give all of them, unbelievable amount. And then David Ellenson came through there because when he became president of the Hebrew Union College, he belonged there. So they all became important mentors.
And I know it's hard to kind of encapsulate what you learned, but what do you think are some of the takeaways from those years?
Robert's teaching was 50% of doing this thing right is showing up. And your sermons, everyone thinks that the sermon is 90% of who the rabbi is. He would say that 90% of who the rabbi is what you do, but he would say, quote unquote, is on the floor, spending time with people. And the other teaching is don't forget that you got to make the donuts every day. That, and I warn, I don't want to sound like the old crotchety rabbi now, but I want to say to younger rabbis, it's not about how polished your post is on social media, it's still about holding the hand in the hospital room. And I think too many of us try to sew together everything that is polished and perfect and beautiful instead of remembering that your real power stands in how it is that you connect to people. So all the other stuff is really important, but it really is all about relationship.
So you're at Rodef for how many years, 12?
I am at Rodef for 13, including my internship.
Wow. And then it's suddenly time to go. People are recruiting you.
I applied and got a New York City pulpit job, but the synagogue was in bad shape. And I just got married, and it took me a while. I didn't get married till I was 36, parents divorced. And a mentor said, you can go and remake that synagogue, but you will not see your house for about 5 years. And I decided that given how long it took me to find Lauren and this incredible woman that I'm married to, that I was not going to play with it. So I gave it up, and it was unbelievably hard for me because I grew up in the Upper West Side. And
when they said you're not going to see your house, they meant you're going to be at the synagogue all the time?
It will take 5 years to fix the place, and you will not come home. So you won't see your kids, and you won't see your wife, and this is all you're going to do. And the rabbinate's pretty close to that anyway, but it was probably 4 hours more or 5 hours more per day, and all consuming. Mm. So I needed to go. So I started getting those phone calls, and Short Hills, New Jersey was a joke in my mind. New Yorkers don't go to New Jersey. And but Lauren said, you keep on interviewing, you need the experience. So I go out there, and within 20 minutes, like went on a date, I fell in love. And they did also. And I got back in the car, and Lauren said, how did it go? With that laugh. And I said, honey, they were extraordinary. And she said, we're not moving to New Jersey. And I would have taken the job within a week, but it took us about 6 weeks because we had to deal with the fact that we were gonna, it sounds crazy, but you're from, we're snooty people in Manhattan. So, but it's been the
wonderful
best move of my life, yeah.
How come?
Because I go back to relationship. People think Short Hills, like the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, are full of whatever it is that people stereotypically envision. But instead, they are people who constantly strive to do right for the world. Like, justice is important, but this is where we get into what, I'm sure you'll ask, but, they do it in different ways than Manhattanites do, meaning that I lived in a monolith in Manhattan. We all voted for Jerry Nadler. We all walked, the idea of voting for George W. Bush was like voting for the devil. And now, of course, anyone would trade in for George W. Bush. But it was bad. My politics and religion were conflated.
And you even give an example that I thought was so perfect of, I think it was Rabbi Levine just acknowledged Reagan's death.
Yes.
And there was kind of almost like bristling.
In fairness, he was a little apologetic, in fairness to the Republican. And next day at Torah study, they were really angry, and I didn't get it. And they said, God forbid, should we vote for someone that you don't agree with, and you make it religiously wrong for us. But the bigger story was the gay and lesbian dinners that we held.
Tell us about that.
Every quarter, we were the only place in town that were doing it, and we had everyone across the spectrum, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and we tried very hard to get straight allies to come, because for all the obvious reasons. So I would go. And I was sitting next to another straight ally, and he said, you guys are such hypocrites. What are you talking about? And he said, all the limousine liberals in this synagogue vote for everything they proclaim to believe in, but none of them show up at these dinners. But look around the room, and I didn't take Republican or Democratic, identification cards, but he must have. And he said, 1, 2, and he pointed out and he said, we're all Republicans here. So we show up for these gay and lesbian dinners, and you excoriate us for our beliefs when we're just trying to get to justice in different ways than you are. And I still blew it off as him being insane until I got to New Jersey, and there, probably 40% of my congregants are Republican, and they started to question if I would actually tend to them pastorally, given my political beliefs. And I said, are you insane? It's like a doctor not operating on a terrorist.
Right.
Of course they're going to do that. But I realized that they thought that it was impacting my pastoral work with them. And I knew I had to take a step back and look in the mirror, in which I took a really long look.
And so a lot of this book is talking about those kind of political givens or orthodoxies within our community that I think sometimes people really don't look at as honestly as you do. You talk about the radical center. What is that?
I'm in an airport. What I always say is communally depressed. I could now feel, now we write about it, we understand it, but I could feel that the community was falling apart. My own community, the world community, the Jewish community, and issues that were not life and death issues were being elevated so that people thought about them in that way. Families were, this is pre-Trump, families were breaking up, communities were breaking, and I didn't understand it. And someone sent me an article, it's actually someone I think you know, and she said, read this, I think it might make you feel better. And the article said, might you consider a radical center? And it distinguished very carefully from a wishy-washy moderate to instead being radically committed to dialogue as much as we are radically committed to our own ideas. And can't we hold this up at least as equal? And there were political advocates, there were sociologists, professors, writers, but no clergy. And I thought, wait a minute, I want to be a rabbi of the Radical Center. So I wrote an article for our professional journal called that, and sure enough, the publisher of this book is right of center. And the reason he wanted to acquire it was he thought that rabbis never changed their minds, which I also didn't understand. And he said, my experience is arrogance and intransigence, not openness.
So how optimistic are you about that needle moving in terms of, first of all, people being more honest now about whether they lean more center than maybe they've been allowed before, but particularly after October 7th, you see shifts happening in terms of ideological assumptions?
There's two different, the Jewish community was more unified than we've ever seen right after October 7th. And now, and this is what I warn about, and sometimes I get to the level of yelling during sermons, do not be duped, is what I say to my congregants. And I believe that the American political system is using us as pawns to acquire their own power and dividing us so that they get our votes, and meanwhile we're not sticking together. And the problem right now is if we're not unified, we could end up destroying ourselves. And that is what I'm really scared of, is not just Israel's destruction, but our own destruction in America. I think, the Prime Minister being invited by the Speaker of the House is a great example of that. I think Chuck Schumer and what he said, Senator Schumer several months ago about Netanyahu, all of these things in the public sphere now serve to divide us, and they don't bring us together. And we may smile as we follow one politician or the other, but in the end, us having the party we want to be put in power could end up destroying us, and I don't think we understand that.
And do you feel like you can talk about that honestly?
I talk about it all the time. I mean, part of it's I've been where I am long enough, and I'll tell you something, you know, I go to Israel at least once. This year I've been there 3 times since October the 7th. We're going back in a few weeks. So I don't do it manipulatively, but it buys me a lot of capital, because they actually think that I'm out of my mind, because the first time was 2 weeks after the war started. And they end up trusting me a lot more, and I don't mind taking positions on both sides. And I became a political independent. I left the Democratic Party because 2 reasons. One is I wanted to be seen as a umpire who called it objectively. And 2 is, quite honestly, there's less room for me in the Democratic Party vis-a-vis Israel now than there used to be.
So finally, how do you want people to read this book? How do you want them to use it? What was your hope in terms of putting it out into the world?
I am sure you've heard the phrase sinat chinam, which means hatred for the sake of hatred. And
baseless hatred.
Baseless hatred. And I think and worry that if we continue down this path of living in silos and in echo chambers and only watching television and internet that just reaffirm our own beliefs, that we are going to bring down our country. I really do believe that, the way that Jerusalem was brought down. Jerusalem did not die in the year 0 or 70 CE because of the outside enemy. We all know that we've beaten enemies that should have beaten us many times in our history. That time we lost because we were so porous ourselves. And I believe right now that we are making ourselves unbelievably weak. And my prayer and hope is that by enabling us to commit to a radical center, to be brave, by the way, it's not called safe space. Safe space to me is the floor upon which we're supposed to walk. The brave space is where we put our seatbelts on and stay in conversation, because I believe that the soul of our country and our people are up for grabs, and we're the only ones who could fix it.
Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz, thank you. The book is To Build a Brave Space, The Making of a Spiritual First Responder. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight, and I'll see you next time.